the paper trail. Let's go, 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 go. Yeah, 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 yeah. For the love of money, niggas come around. For the love of money, some stay around. For the love of money, what a nigga will do. For the love of the money, yeah. I gotta shake it, 12 at night to 5 in the morning, they don't give a fuck now. If it's for the money, niggas gon' bark and they bite like a motherfucking dog. Gotta party like a motherfucking dog. For that cat, I am gon' roof. And I'm barking at that cat, and I am gon' take the roof off. And I'm riding that ride, rip, leaning to the left. But I'm steady on the only right. I'm swerving with a purpose, with a purpose. A nigga been sipping on that purple. A nigga been cheaping on that purple. Cause I'm getting money, I'm getting money. Cause I'm getting money. And I'm laughing all the way to the motherfucking bank. And I'm telling her, tell me later if she thinking what I'm thinking. Damn me getting money. I walk about the bank and I stuck up in the wheel. Headed to my next big destination. Somewhere where I'm gonna be faded, sipping on a motherfucker.
A little bit more about the situation with the tariffs. President Trump saying that he is, quote, absolutely down his global tariffs by a 6-3 ruling. The tariffs levied under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, delivering remarks on President Trump called them, quote, disloyal to our Constitution and lapdogs.
We have alternatives. We'll continue to kill as the opinion is, however. The court said that I'm not allowed to charge even
that you just saw there at the White House just hours after the ruling came down. President Trump called them, quote, disloyal to our Constitution and lapdogs.
We have alternatives. Great alternatives. Could be more money. We'll take in more money and we'll be a lot stronger for it. We're taking in hundreds of billions of dollars. We'll continue to do so. To show you how ridiculous the opinion is, however, the court said that I'm not allowed to charge even $1. I can't charge $1. Can't charge $1. I would have used 1 penny, but we don't make the pennies anymore. We save money. Can't charge $1 to any country. I assume to protect other countries. This must have been done to protect those other countries, certainly not the United States of America, which they should be interested in protecting. And that's what they're supposed to be protecting. But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with a country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1.
And here's a breakdown of how each of the 9 justices went on the issue. President Trump explaining that he has, quote, very powerful alternatives, pledging to impose that new 10% global tariff under a law. Now, he signed that order just hours later, saying it would be effective on all countries almost immediately. The order was issued under Section 122, and it applies in addition to the standard tariffs that are already in place. Now, appearing on Fox News Channel's The Will Cain Show, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked by Will about potential refunds on the tariffs paid over the last several months.
You mentioned 75 billion. Do you anticipate having to make refunds at Treasury?
Well, I'm not going to get out ahead of the courts. And as the president said, the Supreme Court was very discombobulated on this. They didn't give any guidance on it. I think it's probably not 175. I think it's probably closer to 130, but still a substantial amount. They have remanded it back down to a lower court. And as Amy Coney Barrett said in the original hearing that I was at, this could be a mess. And this could take months, this could take years to litigate and to get to the payouts. And if there is a payout, it looks like it's just going to be the ultimate core, because what you don't know is, did a Chinese supplier lower their price? So they lowered their price because of the tariff. The product came into the US, the tariff.
And of course, that was Scott Bessent there on The Will Cain Show. And just about an hour ago, President Trump once again took to Truth Social to talk about this, saying, quote, "My new hero is United States Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and of course, Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that they want to make America great again." There are a lot of questions about exactly what happens next here, so I do want to bring in Elaine Dzenski, the director and head of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Center on Economic and Financial Power. Elaine, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be here.
And of course, one of the big questions here, and this is one that we've been getting, it's actually two questions. What does this ruling do? What does it change, and what doesn't it change?
Right. So essentially what this ruling does is it restricts the president's ability to invoke IEPA as a mechanism for applying tariffs. So this impacts 5 different kinds of tariffs that the administration has deployed under IEPA. It doesn't say that the president can't use IEPA as a mechanism, but it can't be used in the application of tariffs. So this has an impact across a number of different actions that they've taken. Perhaps most importantly, the reciprocal tariffs that were levied globally earlier this year under that authority. So what does this mean? It means that the administration has to go back to other authorities where there is a more clear identification of that power to levy a tariff. And we've already seen that. You mentioned the Section 122 opportunity to use that authority to apply tariffs. The president has already indicated, and I believe has signed a measure to do that, and that will bring a 10% reciprocal tariff on all countries. So they're already deploying other mechanisms that are going to be used to try to stabilize the use of tariffs as they had intended.
And we actually just got another statement coming in on Truth Social moments ago from President Trump. And I want to read this here for the first time with you. It says, based on a thorough, detailed, and complete review of the ridiculous, poorly written, and extraordinarily anti-American decision on tariffs issued yesterday, after many months of contemplation by the United States Supreme Court, please let this statement serve to represent that I, as the President of the United States of America, will be effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been, quote, ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. During the next short number of months, the Trump administration will determine and issue the new and legally permissible tariffs, which will continue our extraordinarily successful process of making America great again, greater than ever before. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So it sounds as though, based on what we're seeing here on Truth Social, that he's now saying that 10% is going to be 15%. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that would be my read on it as well. So he's taking the legally maximum amount here, which would be 15%, and applying it globally. So that's well within the constraints of that particular legal tool, if you will. So yeah, and I think we'll see more under Section 232, Section 301. He has a number of authorities that can be deployed. The duration is what we need to have a look at. So under Section 122, he's allowed to deploy that tariff rate at 15% or up to 15% for up to 150 days. But after that, Congress will have to go along with it. So it is temporary in that sense. It does buy them some time to figure out how they want to cobble together a new structure based on the existing authorities.
As we talk about consumers there, again, we want to focus on how this could impact everyday Americans. Talk about some of maybe the short-term impacts versus potential long-term impacts.
Yeah, it really depends on the sector. So there are some sectors like automotive, pharmaceuticals, food, agricultural products that are already tariffed under other authorities. So we're not likely to see changes in some of those sectors. For others that were covered under, the IEEPA regime, maybe we will see some shifting. For example, for a country that was at 40%, now they're being subject to a 15%. So it really will depend on the product and the country and what they were subject to prior to this ruling. In terms of whether consumers are going to feel this right away, again, it really depends on what they're buying. So we may see a reprieve in certain areas for certain kinds of consumer goods, but not across the board necessarily.
I don't know if you can speak to this, but what role should maybe Congress play now that the court has limited one of the president's authorities there in that ruling? Any idea what role Congress now has to play?
I think that's an excellent question. Well, there's a window now for Congress to come in and work on a more deliberative strategy, ideally with the administration. It is possible that they could pass new authorities or clarify authorities for the president. But what I think the opportunity might be is to work hand in hand with the administration to figure out how to use our economic security power, our economic power, and align around the national security and economic security objectives to create something more durable. And by that, I mean use of these laws in a way that provide stability, no matter what the tariff rate is, identifying.
And of course, we're watching as all of this is playing out in real time. Again, we just got that statement coming in moments ago from President Trump. Not sure if he's going to sign another.
Minutes ago that he's effectively raising all tariffs that he imposed from 10% to 15% effective immediately. We're back on this on again, off again tariff situation. Donald Trump overnight imposed a 10% global tariff to all countries across the globe. And on Truth Social just a few minutes ago, he announced he's raising that to what he says is the maximum legal limit of 15% on all countries across the globe. It's honestly no surprise he's doing it today on a Saturday because the market is closed. If the market was open, the stock market would be. One day he may actually reverse his decisions on these tariffs and just get back to status quo. But he is not happy. He's not happy that the Supreme Court ruled against him, and he's lashing out. And as a result, you, the American consumer, get back to status quo, but he is not happy. He's not happy that the American consumer are going to suffer because, as you well know, tariffs are a tax on the American consumer. Spread the word, follow along for all the news you need to know about.
Cross-eyed and the director of the FBI. You can't even be an eyewitness. He could work on thousands of people at the FAA. And then 14 planes landed upside, cross-eyed, and the director of the FBI. You can't even be an eyewitness. He could work on my case. I'll be right in front of thousands of people at the FAA. And then 14 planes landed upside down. down in 14 days. Y'all didn't say shit.
Breaking news right now, Donald Trump has announced minutes ago that he's effectively raising all tariffs that he imposed from 10% to 15% effective immediately. We're back on this on again, off again tariff situation. Donald Trump overnight imposed a 10% global tariff to all countries across the globe. And on Truth Social just a few minutes ago, he announced he's raising that to what he says is the maximum legal limit of 15% on all countries across the globe. It's honestly no surprise he's doing it today on a Saturday because the market is closed. If the market was open, the stock market would be probably tanking right now, which means that to me, by Monday, he may actually reverse his decisions on these tariffs and just get back to status quo. But he is not happy. He's not happy that the Supreme Court ruled against him and he's lashing out. And as a result, you, the American consumer, are going to suffer because as you well know, tariffs are a tax on the American consumer. Spread the word. Follow along for all the news you need to know about.
Cross-eyed and you can't even be an eyewitness. Your Honor, he looks distracted. He fired thousands of people at the FAA. And then 14 planes landed upside down in 14 days. Y'all didn't say shit. Sometimes they land like that. No, they don't. He got us in 5 wars at one time. Here's the brilliant part. None of the nations that we are at war with, none of them got an army. We just bullies, shut the fuck up. Y'all ain't got no goddamn. Give a fuck about your maple syrup, Canada. Trump said, I will absolutely show you the Epstein files. Then they showed him the files. He said, bitch, is that my name?
Present to the income tax as a specialized, precision-guided weapon of financial justice. The narrative was branded strictly as an eat the rich tax, a necessary tool to level the playing field and force the monopolists to pay their fair share. When Congress debated the imposition of the tax, the political rhetoric was absolute. This would be a temporary, hyper-targeted measure. Members of Congress, who warned that the tax might eventually trickle down to the middle class, were openly mocked and dismissed as paranoid alarmists on the House floor. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was officially ratified, granting Congress the sweeping, terrifying power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states. The initial legislation that activated this power, the Revenue Act of 1913, was brilliantly designed to maintain exemption thresholds were set astronomically $3,000 a year, equivalent to $100,000 today, before a single cent income tax. Less than 1% of the entire United States population qualified to tax. And even for those ultra-wealthy individuals who did qualify, the base rate was a microscopic 1%, scaling up to a maximum surtax of just tax if you chose to buy a specific imported good. Your labor, your savings, and your personal private property were considered sacrosanct, entirely off limits to the probing hands of federal bureaucrats. To breach this constitutional firewall, the proponents of a centralized state required a massive, coordinated psychological operation. They could not simply announce that they intended to take a percentage of the working man's wages, as that would have triggered an immediate political revolt. Instead, the campaign for what would become the 16th Amendment was cloaked in the intoxicating, heavily weaponized rhetoric of class warfare. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the era of the robber barons, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, and the Morgans. The American public was increasingly resentful of the staggering concentration of wealth held by this microscopic industrial elite. The politicians of the progressive era seized upon this resentment and presented the income tax as a specialized, precision-guided weapon of financial justice. The narrative sold to the American public was that an income tax would never, under any circumstances, target the mechanic, the farmer, or the small business owner. It was branded strictly as an eat-the-rich tax, a necessary tool to level the playing field and force the monopolists to pay their fair share. When Congress debated the imposition of the tax, the political rhetoric was absolute. This would be a temporary, hyper-targeted measure. Members of Congress, who warned that the tax might eventually trickle down to the middle class, were openly mocked and dismissed as paranoid alarmists on the House floor. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was officially ratified, granting Congress the sweeping, terrifying power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states. The initial legislation that activated this power, the Revenue Act of 1913, was brilliantly designed to maintain the illusion of a specialized class tax. The exemption thresholds were set astronomically high for the era. An individual had to earn over $3,000 a year, equivalent to roughly $100,000 today, before they paid a single cent in income tax. Less than 1% of the entire United States population qualified to pay the tax. And even for those ultra-wealthy individuals who did qualify, the base rate was a microscopic 1%, scaling up to a maximum surtax of just 7% on the absolute highest earners in the country. To the average American citizen in 1913, the passage of the 16th Amendment was a non-event. It was a headline in a newspaper about a penalty levied on a Wall Street banker. They did not realize that the camel's nose was now firmly underneath the tent. They did not understand that the fundamental relationship between the citizen and the state had just undergone a violent, irreversible inversion. Before 1913, the philosophical presumption of the American system was that your labor and the fruits of your labor belonged 100% to you, and you voluntarily surrendered a small portion of it through consumption. The ratification of the 16th Amendment legally established the exact opposite premise. The federal government now possessed a prior primary claim on your labor. The state owned the entirety of your income by default, and the tax code was simply the mechanism by which the government benevolently decided how much of your own money you were legally permitted to keep. The citizen was no longer a sovereign individual. They had been mathematically transformed into a fiscal serf, an economic unit whose primary function was to generate revenue for a centralized authority. But the income tax was only one half of the 1913 wealth transfer matrix. The 16th Amendment was ratified in February of that year. Just 10 months later, in December 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, establishing a privately owned central banking cartel with the monopolistic power to issue the nation's currency. These two events are not historically coincidental. They are the twin pillars of a single, highly integrated financial architecture. They are functionally inseparable. To understand why an income tax was an absolute prerequisite for a central bank, one must understand the mechanics of fiat debt. When a central bank issues fiat currency, it does not create wealth, it creates debt. Every dollar printed by the Federal Reserve is loaned into existence and carries an interest obligation. If the government wants to borrow massive amounts of money from this new central bank to fund sprawling bureaucratic agencies, foreign interventions, or endless entitlement programs, the central bank requires a guarantee. It requires collateral. The Federal Reserve could not simply print infinite currency for the U.S. Treasury unless the Treasury had a guaranteed, ironclad mechanism to extract wealth from the population to pay the interest on that newly created debt. The 16th Amendment provided that exact collateral. The collateral for the Federal Reserve's endless money printing was not gold, and it was not land. The collateral was the future, unearned labor of the American taxpayer. The income tax acts as the servicing mechanism for the national debt. Without the legal authority to reach directly into the paycheck of every working citizen and extract a percentage of their labor, the federal government could never have secured the astronomical loans required to build a modern, hyper-indebted administrative state. The income tax is the collection agency for the central bank. The deception that the income tax was a temporary measure strictly for the rich evaporated almost immediately, validating every paranoid warning of the anti-tax isolationists. The catalyst, as is always the case in the expansion of state power, was a geopolitical crisis. With the outbreak of World War I, the federal government suddenly required staggering amounts of capital to fund the military-industrial complex. The Revenue Acts of 1916 and 1917 were rammed through Congress, ruthlessly slashing the exemption thresholds and exposing a massive new swath of the middle class to direct taxation. Simultaneously, the rates skyrocketed. The top marginal tax rate, which had been a mere 7% just 4 years prior, was violently ratcheted up to an astonishing 77% to fund the war effort. The crisis proved the ultimate political axiom. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Once the war ended, the rates were lowered slightly, but the architecture of mass extraction remained permanently in place. The government had tasted the intoxicating power of direct wealth confiscation, and the bureaucratic apparatus had expanded to rely on it. The eat the rich narrative was quietly abandoned, replaced by a system that aggressively targeted the vast productive middle class, because that is where the true mathematical volume of a nation's wealth resides. The 1913 legislation did not punish the monopolists. It effectively pulled up the ladder of capital formation ensuring that a working-class citizen would find it mathematically nearly impossible to accumulate enough retained earnings to ever challenge the established financial elite. The metamorphosis of the American income tax from a highly targeted microscopic penalty on the elite into a sprawling, inescapable dragnet capturing the entire working population was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate, methodical expansion of state power catalyzed by crisis. While World War I introduced the concept of higher rates, it was the catastrophic economic collapse of the Great Depression and the subsequent total mobilization for World War II that permanently cemented the extraction apparatus. During the 1930s, under the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the tax code was overtly weaponized as a tool of social engineering and wealth redistribution. The Revenue Act of 1932, signed in the dying days of the Hoover administration but embraced by the New Deal, violently yanked the top marginal rate from 25% up to 63%. By 1936, Roosevelt pushed that top rate to 79%, and by the height of the Second World War, the top marginal tax rate in the United States reached an astonishing confiscatory 94%. However, focusing solely on the top marginal rates applied to millionaires obscures the true devastating paradigm shift that occurred in the shadows of the war effort. The government did not merely raise the ceiling, they systematically obliterated the floor. To finance the staggering logistical requirements of a two-front global war, the United States Treasury realized that taxing the rich was mathematically insufficient. There were simply not enough millionaires to fund the production of thousands of B-17 bombers and aircraft carriers. The true volume of national wealth resided in the collective wages of the middle and lower middle classes. In 1939, before the outbreak of the war in Europe, the income tax was still fundamentally a class tax. Only about 4 million Americans, a tiny fraction of the population, earned enough to cross the exemption thresholds and file a return. By 1945, that number had exploded to nearly 43 million. The tax net had been thrown over the entire American workforce. This transformation from a class tax to a mass tax required an unprecedented psychological propaganda campaign. The Treasury Department commissioned Walt Disney to produce animated films, most notably The New Spirit, starring Donald Duck, to convince a reluctant, historically anti-tax public that paying a massive portion of their income directly to Washington was the ultimate expression of patriotic duty. The narrative was entirely inverted. Keeping the fruits of your own labor was framed as selfish, while surrendering your wealth to the state was framed as defeating fascism. But propaganda alone could not solve a critical, logistical nightmare facing the federal government. Prior to 1943, Americans paid their income taxes in a single lump sum payment on March 15th for the income they had earned in the previous year, as the government drastically lowered the exemption limits to capture the wages of factory workers, mechanics, and clerks. They encountered a terrifying reality. The average working class citizen did not possess the financial to taxed Americans defaulted on their tax bills because they had already spent the money on food. The entire war financing apparatus would collapse into chaos. The solution to this existential threat was engineered by a man named produce animated films, most notably The New Spirit, starring Donald Duck, to convince a reluctant, historically anti-tax public that paying a massive portion of their income directly to Washington was the ultimate expression of patriotic duty. The narrative was entirely inverted. Keeping the fruits of your own labor was framed as selfish, while surrendering your wealth to the state was framed as defeating fascism. But propaganda alone could not solve a critical, logistical nightmare facing the federal government. Prior to 1943, Americans paid their income taxes in a single lump sum payment on March 15th for the income they had earned in the previous year, as the government drastically lowered the exemption limits to capture the wages of factory workers, mechanics, and clerks. They encountered a terrifying reality. The average working class citizen simply did not possess the financial discipline to save 20 or 30% of their wages throughout the year to hand over to the government the following spring. If millions of newly taxed Americans defaulted on their tax bills because they had already spent the money on food, housing, and survival, the entire war financing apparatus would collapse into chaos. The solution to this existential threat was engineered by a man named Beardsley Rumel, who was not a politician, but the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In 1943, Congress passed the Current Tax Payment Act, widely known as the Rumel Plan. This piece of legislation is arguably the most insidious, psychologically brilliant, and destructive financial mechanism ever implemented against the American worker. The Rumel Plan introduced the concept of withholding at the source. Instead of asking the citizen to write a check to the government at the end of the year, the government mandated that every employer in the United States must automatically deduct the tax from the employee's paycheck before the employee ever saw the money. The employer was legally conscripted to act as an unpaid tax collector for the federal government. This completely revolutionized the psychology of taxation. When a tax is withheld at the source, the citizen never physically possesses the money. Because they never hold it, they do not feel the agonizing sting of losing it. The psychological pain of writing a massive check to the Treasury is entirely bypassed. A worker simply accepts that their gross salary is a fiction, a theoretical number on a piece of paper, and their take-home pay is their actual reality. The Rommel Plan successfully anesthetized the American public to the sheer volume of wealth being extracted from them. Furthermore, withholding birthed the brilliant psychological illusion of the tax refund. By intentionally over-withholding slightly from every paycheck, the government forces the citizen to give them an interest-free loan throughout the year. When the citizen files their return in April and receives a fraction of their own money back, they are psychologically conditioned to view it as a gift, a windfall from a benevolent government, rather than the return of stolen property. This mechanism permanently neutralized the threat of a widespread tax revolt. The working class was mathematically captured, sedated by the illusion of refunds, and systematically drained of their ability to accumulate generational capital. This system of mass extraction works in lethal tandem with the second pillar of the 1913 architecture, the Federal Reserve. The true horror of the American financial system is not merely that you are taxed on your income. It is that you are subjected to a brutal, invisible double taxation mechanism driven by fiat currency debasement. The Federal Reserve has a stated target of perpetual inflation, continually expanding the money supply and deliberately reducing the purchasing power of the dollar. As inflation ravages the economy, the cost of living skyrockets. To simply maintain their basic standard of living, workers must demand higher nominal wages. When a worker receives a cost of living raise, they have not actually increased their purchasing power. They are simply treading water in an inflating currency. However, the federal tax code historically does not care about purchasing power. It operates purely on nominal numbers. This creates a predatory phenomenon known as bracket creep. As inflation forces your nominal salary higher, you are artificially pushed into higher marginal tax brackets. The government taxes a larger percentage of your income, even though your real inflation-adjusted wealth has not increased by a single cent. Through this mechanism, the government wins twice. First, they extract wealth invisibly through the Federal Reserve's inflation, effectively stealth defaulting on the national debt by paying it back with cheaper, debased dollars. Second, they use that exact same inflation to push the working class into higher tax brackets, forcing them to hand over a larger percentage of their remaining devalued currency. It is a perfectly engineered, self-sustaining doom loop of wealth confiscation. The synergy between the Federal Reserve and the IRS is the engine of the modern American empire. The central bank prints the debt required to fund endless foreign wars, massive bureaucratic agencies, politically motivated corporate bailouts. The income tax system, supercharged by withholding and that new printed debt, is serviced by the American middle class. The 1913 architecture fundamentally altered the destiny of the republic. It replaced a system of monetary funding sovereign citizenry with a system of mandatory extraction and financial subservience. The temporary tax on the monopolists became a permanent increased by a single cent. Through this mechanism, the government wins twice. First, they extract wealth invisibly through the Federal Reserve's inflation, effectively stealth defaulting on the national debt by paying it back with cheaper, debased dollars. Second, they use that exact same inflation to push the working class into higher tax brackets, forcing them to hand over a larger percentage of their remaining devalued currency. It perfectly engulfs the doom of wealth confiscation. The synergy between the Federal Reserve and the IRS is the engine of the modern American empire. The central bank prints the debt required to fund endless foreign wars, massive bureaucracies, and politically motivated corporate bailouts. The income tax system, supercharged by withholding and bracket creep, guarantees that the interest on that newly printed debt is serviced directly from the sweat and labor of the American middle class. The 1913 architecture fundamentally altered the destiny of the republic. It replaced a system of voluntary funding and sovereign citizenry with a system of mandatory extraction and financial subservience. The temporary tax on the monopolists became a permanent, inescapable yoke on the neck of the working man. By stripping away the ability of the average citizen to retain the majority of their earnings, the system effectively pulled up the ladder of economic mobility. It ensured that the vast majority of the population would live paycheck to paycheck, perpetually reliant on debt to finance their lives. While the state grew into a leviathan of unimaginable proportions, entirely unconstrained by the gold standard, a truly untaxed populace. The ultimate triumph of the 1913 architecture is the complete inversion of the American economic class structure. We are told constantly by politicians that the income tax is a progressive system designed to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. The mathematical reality of every economic metric of the modern era is that the combination of a central bank and a fiat income tax system is the most efficient engine for upward wealth redistribution ever conceived by the human mind. The system does not punish the financial elite. It aggressively protects them by constructing an impenetrable barrier to entry for the working class. It is a system that, while allowing accumulated capital to compound virtually untouched. To understand how the modern billionaire class completely bypasses the extraction grid that traps the average citizen, you must understand a foundational economic principle known as the Cantillon effect. Coined by the 18th century French banker Richard Cantillon, this principle explains that when a central bank creates new money out of thin air, that money does not enter the economy evenly. The entities positioned closest to the money spigot, the massive commercial banks, the defense contractors, the hedge funds, and the politically connected megacorporations, receive the new currency first. They get to spend this new money and acquire real assets before the currency circulating in the broader economy has been diluted. By the time that newly printed money finally trickles down to the mechanic, the teacher, or the factory worker in the form of a slightly higher nominal wage, the prices of housing, food, and energy have already skyrocketed. The middle class absorbs the inflation, while the elite absorb the purchasing power. But the Cantillon effect is only the first half of the wealth transfer. The second half is the tax code itself. The 16th Amendment fundamentally targets income, which is the compensation you receive for exchanging your finite time and physical labor for wages. The ultra-wealthy do not generate their wealth through W-2 wage labor. They generate wealth through the appreciation of assets, stocks, commercial real estate, privately held corporations, and intellectual property. The tax code treats these two forms of wealth generation entirely differently. The modern billionaire executes a perfectly legal, mathematically flawless maneuver commonly referred to in elite wealth management circles as the buy, borrow, die strategy. When a founder builds a massive technology company and their stock appreciates by tens of billions of dollars, they do not sell the stock to buy a mansion or a mega yacht. Selling the stock would trigger a massive capital gains tax event. Instead, they take their shares to a major Wall Street bank and pledge them as collateral for a massive low-interest portfolio loan. Because debt is not legally classified as income, the borrowed millions are completely 100% tax-free. They live a lifestyle of unimaginable luxury funded entirely by untaxed debt, while their underlying assets continue to compound at a rate far higher than the microscopic interest rate they are paying to the bank. When they eventually pass away, the assets are transferred to their heirs. The cost basis of the stock is stepped up to the current market value. The loans are paid off, and the entire tax obligation simply vanishes into the ether. Meanwhile, the surgeon, the engineer, or the small business owner who earns a high salary through sheer grinding labor is brutally penalized. They are trapped in the highest marginal tax brackets, stripped of 40 to 50% of their wealth before it ever hits their bank account, and completely locked out of the buy, borrow, die loophole. They are locked out because their primary asset is their own physical labor, which a bank will not accept as collateral for a perpetual tax-free loan. The 1913 income tax did not eat the rich. It created a permanent, insurmountable moat around them. It ensures that no matter how hard a citizen works, they can never earn enough post-tax income to challenge the established asset-owning aristocracy. We have a terminal phase. The United States national debt is careening past $36 trillion, thus interest payments alone are consuming over $1 trillion a year, exceeding the entire budget of the Department of Defense. The federal government is facing a mathematical certainty. The debt can never be repaid with the current level of taxation. They have two choices. They can either dramatically increase the extraction of wealth from the populace, or they can order the Federal Reserve to print the difference, effectively defaulting on the debt through hyperinflation. They are actively preparing to do both. The recent unprecedented expansion of the Internal Revenue Service, the hiring of tens of thousands of new agents, and the modernization of their enforcement technology is not designed to complex multinational corporate tax structures. It is designed to aggressively squeeze the remaining juice from the vast, unprotected middle class and the small business sector. The introduction of third-party payment reporting networks and the relentless push towards central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, represent the final absolute closure of the extraction grid. A CBDC is not a technological upgrade, it is a programmable control mechanism. It would allow the central bank and the Treasury to track, monitor, and instantly, automatically tax every single transaction in real time, completely eliminating the shadow economy and stripping the citizen of any remaining financial privacy. The system built in 1913 is functioning exactly as it was intended. It is a highly efficient vacuum designed to transfer the productive energy of the nation into the hands of the state and its chosen financial beneficiaries. To survive the collapse of this debt supercycle, you must fundamentally restructure your relationship with money, labor, and the state. You must execute a personal financial secession from the fiat extraction grid. The first defensive mandate is to aggressively transition your wealth generation from labor to capital. You must minimize the amount of your wealth that is exposed to the W-2 income tax dragnet. This requires utilizing legal corporate structures, trusts, and strategic business entities that allow you to control assets and write off expenses before the government calculates your tax liability. The tax code is a rulebook written by the asset-owning class. You must learn to play the game by their rules. You must stop trading your time for depreciating fiat currency and start acquiring the hard, scarce assets central banks cannot print and the politicians cannot easily confiscate. This is the exact purpose of physical gold and silver. For thousands of years, precious metals have served as the ultimate uncounterfeitable store of human labor. When you hold a physical gold coin, you're holding retained, untaxed energy that exists entirely outside the banking system. It is a silent, undeniable protest against the Federal Reserve's inflation mandate. In the digital age, this principle is perfected by Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the absolute antithesis of the 1913 architecture. It is a monetary system with a strictly fixed, unalterable supply cap of 21 million coins. It cannot be inflated by a central bank to fund a war. It cannot be debased to bail out a failing corporation. And because it exists on a decentralized, cryptographically secure network, it cannot be seized or frozen by a desperate Treasury Department. It is the first time in human history that the average citizen has access to an apex predator reserve asset that requires no permission from the state to hold or transfer. The story of 1913 is the story of how a free people voluntarily surrendered their economic sovereignty for the illusion of class fairness and the false promise of government security. They traded the robust, untaxed liberty of the 19th century for the bureaucratic, hyper-indebted serfdom of the 21st century. The chains are not made of iron. They are made of fiat currency, withholding taxes and inflation. The system will not reform itself. The politicians will never dismantle the mechanism that grants them infinite power. The only way out of the 1913 trap is through aggressive, unapologetic financial independence. The wealth transfer will continue, but you have the power to decide which
Bang, bang. Now, we do know that Epstein was the forerunner to this whole Bitcoin. Of course, he would create the digital dollar before it was created for everybody else to use. Of course. Why wouldn't he? Be in the front of the race. Why wouldn't he? Follow me now, face ad boy. So, 1913, the real reset, I would say, happened 1913. The real reset. If we're talking about the foundational reset, 1913 on. 1913 on, they were able to collect funds yearly. Then they saw that, hey, people ain't got enough money to make this payment at the end of the year. We need to switch this shit up. They make you pay your tax at the beginning of the year, which was April during that time. They switched the beginning of the year also after 1913, which is another part of history they're not talking about. The first of the year was April. They switched that up to like January the 1st also. So this once you start collecting people's money, that's a lot of money. What you gonna do with it? You said is what you're gonna do with it. You're gonna fund every other nation you need to come into power to be within your reach to be able to do what you need them to do. And again, these people went over there and created all of these magnificent buildings, a lot of them in the 1900s over there in Afro-Eurasia. They just built a lot of those buildings to match a narrative that they were spinning here in America. That's how they're able to rewrite the 1800s. They're able to go over there and build what they want in the story to happen, when the real buildings have always been here in America. Switch the foundational piece to a work of art in the Middle East. Peep the play. It's being played on every aspect that you don't think that they're planning to play on. Every level. It's a different fight you gotta fight. Bang, bang. Balance. Let go.